Committee will come to order. Welcome to the Solving the Climate Crisis, Cleaning Up Heavy-Duty Vehicles, Protecting Communities hearing of the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. Before we begin, I wanted to first say that we all share in a sense of relief for the ranking member Graves, and in the aftermath of Hurricane Barry, we were just talking that thank goodness it wasn't quite the rain event that they had predicted, and we're grateful for that. We're grateful that there wasn't more storm damage or flooding in New Orleans or Louisiana, because I think they've had their fair share of disasters. And as sea levels rise and as communities deal with heavier rainfall during storms, we are going to have to partner with our local communities to ensure that they can adapt. We are all in this together. This Congress and this committee will always step up to help people who are hurt by disasters. And we want to help communities become more resilient in the face of the climate crisis. For example, I visited Rep. McEachin's district last week in Virginia, and we were very impressed by the work being done there in the Hampton Roads to Richmond area on resiliency. They are planning ahead for climate impacts and flooding, and they had many recommendations for their federal partners as we adapt all across the country. Over the past weeks, our committee has been examining ways to cut carbon pollution. We focused on the electric power sector first. And fortunately, there is progress in the power sector. So much progress that it's the transportation sector that is now our largest source of carbon pollution. And in recent years, it has been growing. More than 90% of the energy used in transportation still comes from fossil fuels. In the power sector, the ways to cut pollution at power plants and bring new clean energy sources onto the grid are relatively straightforward. But vehicles and industrial transport are different. Cars, trains, planes, trucks, buses, and ships all use different technology to move people and goods. Today we're focusing on heavy-duty trucks and buses in particular. There are two big reasons that we want to start here. First, low-income communities and communities of color are hit hard by air pollution from heavy-duty vehicles. That's because of the ongoing repercussions of historic racial discriminatory practices like redlining. The neighborhoods surrounding polluting facilities, including ports and busy highways, aren't rich. They're home to working people and people of color. And air pollution from these facilities causes asthma, lung cancer, and other ailments. And it's a big reason why the zip code you were born in has such a powerful effect on your health. Moving heavy-duty transportation to cleaner technologies can help address these ongoing inequities that can improve people's health and help us tackle the climate crisis. Second, Congress can play a very important role in deploying cleaner trucks and buses. Congress can fund state and local initiatives to secure clean technology, and we can create new tax incentives for innovative technologies. Federal research and development can also bring new engine technology from the lab to the marketplace. California is currently leading the charge to reduce carbon pollution at its many ports and along highways. Three of our witnesses here today are from California, and they will be able to describe this policy leadership in detail. For instance, when ships make it to the largest ports in California, they have to tap into shoreside power instead of running their engines. I saw some of this in action when I visited Congresswoman Brownlee's district. We went to Port Hueneme a couple months ago. They call themselves the greenest port, and we were impressed, and we've got to replicate this now across the country. The aim is to save money on shipping as well as cutting dangerous air pollution. Ports are also the test bed for heavy-duty truck technology, so the state is funding demonstration projects for zero-emission trucks that move goods from ships. And they're committed to transitioning public transit buses to zero emissions by 2040. Additionally, we know that children are particularly susceptible to air pollution. In fact, students are exposed to more diesel exhaust inside a school bus than drivers in the cars behind those buses. So California is funding zero-emission school buses, which is something I think we should all be interested in, given the importance of protecting children's health. Finally, we're not the only country working on this technology. We're in a race with India, with China, with Europe. But with American ingenuity, we can grow our economy, protect our health, and fight the climate crisis. I think this is a very exciting topic because we know that America can lead the world with well-paying jobs as we transition to clean energy. At this time, I'm happy to recognize the Ranking Member Graves for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate you holding this hearing, and I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today. I'm looking forward to the opportunity today to talk a bit about opportunities before us, opportunities to reduce energy costs for American citizens, opportunities to diversify energy opportunities for Americans, opportunities to help ensure that we have a clean environment to pass on to our children and generations to come. Just better understanding what opportunities are before us, understanding the state of technology, understanding where we are from a technological capacity perspective to be able to transition into some of these opportunities that perhaps are there for us to produce these cleaner fuel vehicles, to produce vehicles that perform better, to produce vehicles that reduce energy cost for consumers. What are the obstacles? What are the obstacles to technology? The chair and I had a meeting recently where we discussed the fact that current conventional fuels in some cases have 30 times the energy density as other renewable technologies or battery storage technologies. So understanding how do we bridge that gap? What are the technological hurdles and how can we better ensure that our climate change technology program that's run through the Department of Energy, including various federal agencies, is focused on those right problems to ensure that we can address the solutions. What are the consequences to our actions as we transition? As I've mentioned several times, my home state of Louisiana, we have the lowest electricity cost in the United States, nearly 9 cents a kilowatt hour in Louisiana, the lowest cost. How do we continue to transition to this broader portfolio without adversely affecting those that would be impacted the most, the poor in our community? In that same meeting where we had where we discussed the density of some conventional fuels, some of the experts that we met with indicated that we perhaps are decades away from having the battery storage capacity for heavy-duty and long-haul trucks and boats and things along those lines. So I'm interested in hearing your perspective on where we are with battery storage technology. I know, Mr. Popple, you all have made tremendous progress in the range of some of the buses that you have produced in recent years, and it really is impressive. But how do we continue building upon those types of successes and wins? And as the chair noted, ensuring that we do this in a manner where America wins. We had hearings in the Transportation Committee where I also served, where BYD, a Chinese bus manufacturer, was coming in, and it appears to be a state-owned enterprise, coming in and knocking out domestic bus manufacturers and being subsidized by the Chinese government, coming in and assembling buses in California, in some of our own communities, only to undercut price, knock out domestic production of those same types of vehicles, therefore giving China an advantage and ensuring that American companies, that American laborers have an opportunity to continue to work in this space. Clearly, there are opportunities before us. I'm looking forward to hearing from each of you where those opportunities are for win-win-wins, where we can have an opportunity to lower cost for our Americans, where we have an opportunity to provide more opportunities for energy sources for Americans, and of course, opportunities to ensure that we have a clean environment for generations to come. So thanks again to all of you for being here and looking forward to your testimony. Yield back.
Thank you very much. Without objection, members have 5 legislative days, 5 business days to enter an opening statement into the record. And now I'd like to turn to introductions of our terrific panel today. Angela Logan is campaign director for the Moving Forward Network. Mr. Logan is the co-founder of East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice and serves on several organizations working to protect community health, including the South Coast Air Quality Management District, Environmental Justice Advisory Group, the I-710 Corridor Advisory Committees, and the Southern California Association of Governments Goods Movement Task Force, among others. Michelle Romero is the National Director of Green for All, which seeks to build an inclusive green economy strong enough to lift people out of poverty. Prior to joining Green for All, Ms. Romero worked with the University of California President Janet Napolitano, who she advised on issues at the intersection of politics, policy, and communications. She also spent 5 years leading the Claiming Our Democracy program at the Green Lining Institute. Brian Popple is president and CEO of Proterra, which manufactures zero-emission battery electric buses. Prior to Proterra, Mr. Popple was a partner at Kleiner Perkins. He also served as a senior director of finance at Tesla, focusing on strategic planning and technology cost reduction. And Tony Satterthwaite is a vice president at Cummins, Inc., and president of Cummins Distribution Business. Prior to his current role, Mr. Satterthwaite led Cummins Power Generation from 2008 to 2015. He has worked at Cummins since 1988. Without objection, the witnesses' written statements will be made part of the record. With that, Mr. Logan, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me here today to testify before you. My name is Angela Logan. I'm with the Moving Forward Network, a network of 50 organizations across the country that coalesce to fight for environmental justice and climate justice in and around freight communities such as ports, rail yards, logistics centers, from Seattle to Savannah, from Mobile to Detroit. The freight transportation system, otherwise known as goods movement, is the system in which moves our products from point of manufacturing to point of consumption. It's the trucks, the trains, the ships, the cargo handling equipment that moves our goods from places like Southeast Asia to the Home Depots across the country. This system, again, trucks, trains, ships, cargo handling equipment, predominantly is moved by diesel power. Diesel power or diesel-powered engines produce diesel exhaust. Diesel exhaust is a known carcinogen and a potent climate pollutant. The freight system itself produces approximately or contributes approximately 3 billion tons of CO2 worldwide annually. Also, the freight transportation sector accounts for roughly 9% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, and again is a major climate pollutant. To top that off, the freight sector is predominantly in communities of color, working class, working poor communities of color. To give you an example of how that impacts folks, African Americans are at risk about 3 times their proportion of the U.S. population, and Latinos about 2 times their proportion. As an example, the ports of LA and Long Beach, the communities that I live in, is the #1 source of air pollution in a region that is arguably the most polluted region in the country. With that said, communities have come together along with the local jurisdictions to really advance a cleaner action plan and actually get the mayors of Long Beach and Los Angeles to commit to a 100% zero-emission port complex by 2035. They've seen with the local community and local jurisdiction that resolving this issue of both environmental justice and climate crisis can be both a win-win, both in manufacturing, both in moving goods, both in reducing climate impacts and resolving environmental justice. With that said, I'd like to urge you all to include in your report the following actions. First, protect the Clean Air Act and the National Environmental Policy Act throughout all legislative actions. oppose all provisions to any infrastructure bill or surface transportation reauthorization bill. Weakening the Clean Air Act and NEPA would hinder our ability to address climate change. Second, develop and adopt policy principles for climate legislation that advance climate justice, environmental justice, community self-determination, and local solutions. Develop a process and policy principles for climate legislation in conjunction with environmental justice groups, similar to that of the House Committee on Natural Resources, spearheaded by Chairman Grijalva and Representative McEachin. Also, provide EPA with the tools and resources needed to meet its mission and play a role in resolving the climate crisis. Appropriation funds can be made to environmental justice grants to frontline communities so that they have the resources to promote local solutions and address the climate crisis as they become more resilient. Also, adding more resources to the DERA program, focusing predominantly on zero-emission technologies. Also with that, you should hold EPA accountable on meeting their mission and their legal requirements under the Clean Air Act by holding hearings and holding them to task, specifically for advancing national standards for heavy-duty trucks, ocean-going vessels, national standards for locomotives. And with that, I wanted to just say that the Moving Forward Network looks forward to engaging with you all in the future, and we're here to serve you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Logan. Ms. Romero, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to present solutions today. My name is Michelle Romero, and I'm the National Director of Green for All, a nonprofit program that was founded by Van Jones more than a decade ago to build an inclusive green economy strong enough to lift people out of poverty. We're known for our advocacy on behalf of green jobs and policy solutions that put people to work, building a more sustainable future. Earlier this year, Green for All, in partnership with Clean Energy Works, the Chispa League of Conservation Voters, and Mothers Out Front launched a campaign called Fuel Change to tackle the transportation sector emissions that are in our communities and accelerate the transition to a zero-emission future together. We're mobilizing people and resources around the country to bring clean cars, trucks, and buses to the communities who need it most, low-income communities and communities of color overburdened by pollution. And this year, we are focusing our attention on school buses. 25 million children in the U.S. ride a bus on their way to get an education. More than 2/3 of our nation's bus fleets are actually school buses, and 90% of those are run on diesel. We know all of the research, right? Diesel and gasoline-powered vehicles lead to asthma, cancer, decreased lung function, even cognitive issues like problems focusing. It's hard to learn if you can't breathe. Childhood asthma affects millions of children nationwide, predominantly kids of color, and is a top reason for missed school days. But when asthma strikes, it isn't just the children who are missing school. Caregivers and families spend hundreds of dollars in healthcare costs and have to miss work as well. And this is completely preventable. New technology exists that does not cause these problems. We ask the committee to put our kids on buses going forward to a clean energy future. The future is electric, and we should be the leader in electric vehicle manufacturing. Let's give people jobs making smart batteries and smart buses. Electric buses have zero tailpipe emissions and are cheaper to fuel and maintain. Today's electric school buses, can travel up to 155 miles on a single charge. According to the Union of Concerned Scientists, electric buses also have fewer carbon emissions than diesel, natural gas, and diesel hybrid buses, no matter where in the country they are powered from the electrical grid. That means even the cleanest of these alternative buses, the diesel hybrid, generates more than twice as many carbon emissions as an electric bus, making electric buses the clear winner here. Electric buses can also provide additional benefits through grid-connected storage. And with so many positive benefits, several school districts are already beginning to make this transition. Twin Rivers Unified School District in Sacramento, California, where I live, has the largest electric school bus fleet in the country with 25 buses. And they're joined by school districts in Chicago, Massachusetts, New York, and Minnesota, all that have electric, each of which has electric school buses. States like Colorado, Nevada, and Maryland have also advanced policies this year to invest in electric school buses. And I'm here to say these school districts, to actually accelerate this for all communities across the country, are going to need help. Buying an electric bus is still at least double or can be triple the price of a comparable diesel bus. And that's why Green for All supports the Clean School Bus Act, which was introduced by U.S. Senator Kamala Harris and colleagues, and would encourage the U.S. House of Representatives to introduce similar legislation. The Clean School Bus Act invests $1 billion over 5 years for a clean school bus grant program that would provide grants of up to $2 million to help school districts replace dirty diesel buses with clean electric zero-emission buses. And most importantly, it gives priority to applications that serve low-income students, helping us replace the most polluting buses and leveraging other funding to further decrease pollution. A federal program like this would be a huge help. And by prioritizing public and private investments to electrify the neighborhoods who need it most, we can ensure a just transition that gives every child a clean and safe ride to school. In addition to public funding, we can look at inclusive financing programs that are helping low-income energy customers afford the upfront cost of things like building energy efficiency upgrades and apply a similar model to transportation through utility-inclusive financing. With public funding and private financing, we can accelerate this transition. The only way forward for our country, our children, and our economy is to have a swift and just transition toward a zero-emission future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Romero. Mr. Popple, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairwoman Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and distinguished members of the Select Committee, on behalf of Proterra, thank you for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing. I applaud your leadership in focusing today on the climate crisis and on the role that heavy-duty vehicles can play in helping to solve that crisis. My name is Ryan Popple, and I am CEO of Proterra, a leader in the design and manufacture of zero-emission, heavy-duty electric transit buses. We also provide technology solutions to power other heavy-duty electric applications, such as school buses and over-the-road motor coaches. Our vision, one that I am passionate about, is to provide clean, quiet transportation for all. Our buses are deployed throughout the United States, heavily in California, but throughout the rest of the 50 states as well. And just as importantly, those buses are designed, engineered, and manufactured in the United States. I am honored to appear before you today to discuss the urgency of reducing emissions caused by heavy-duty transportation. I'd like to summarize my written testimony by making the following few points. First, transportation is a leading contributor to U.S. carbon emissions. According to the EPA, greenhouse gas emissions from transportation account for approximately 29% of total U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. It is therefore critical that we begin to reduce this dangerous level of transportation pollution. Second, communities across the United States struggle to address the harmful effects of air pollution. What makes this situation worse and troubling is that there are areas, particularly disadvantaged communities, that bear a disproportionate share of the air pollution burden. Exposure to particulate matter is linked to a range of severe health issues, including heart, lung, asthma, and upper respiratory problems. Third, Proterra electric transit buses that are currently serving our communities, airports, and universities are already making a significant difference in addressing these and other issues. Every time a Proterra electric bus with zero tailpipe emissions replaces a diesel bus, greenhouse gas emissions are reduced by approximately 230,000 pounds, and noise pollution is significantly lessened. Our buses have displaced more than 50 million pounds of greenhouse gas emissions, and we have helped transit customers save money on fuel and spare parts. I applaud this committee's focus on solving the climate crisis, a topic that we take seriously at Proterra. In order to improve public health, it is critical that we prioritize electrifying heavy-duty vehicles in the United States, and we make zero-emission battery electric technology available to all U.S. communities. Electrifying transportation, however, does more than just clean up the environment and improve public health. It helps boost the economy by creating good-paying jobs. We employ more than 500 employees in California and South Carolina, and we have also helped create jobs indirectly through our supply base, like our composite suppliers in Iowa, who help build the body of our bus. We have come a long way in a short period of time. We can do more with your help. I have detailed several policy suggestions in my written comments, but I'd like to specifically mention the following three. Number one, reauthorize the Lono program and increase funding. The Federal Transit Administration's low or no emission vehicle program has been responsible for accelerating hundreds of electric buses, but the funding has been limited. If we are serious about delivering cleaner mobility solutions to all communities, we should significantly increase appropriations for this program in particular and make this a national priority. We'd like to see the FAST Act reauthorized and the Lono program reauthorized at higher funding levels. Number two, we'd like to see transit agencies incentivized to transition to the most efficient forms of bus technology. Under current funding levels, the federal government will pay up to 85% of the cost of a new bus, which includes buses that run on fossil fuels. We suggest that Congress prioritize that funding for transit technologies that are the cleanest and the most efficient to operate. And finally, like my colleague, we would encourage you to implement grant programs for other heavy-duty vehicle sectors. Senator Kamala Harris and colleagues recently introduced the Clean School Bus Act to accelerate the electrification of school bus fleets. This bill authorizes grants of up to $2 million to replace diesel school buses with electric school buses. We support it and urge Congress to pass it and appropriate funding. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. I look forward to answering any questions that you have.
Thank you. Mr. Satterwhite, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Castor, Ranking Member Graves, members of the Select Committee, thank you for inviting me here today and for your interest in clean technologies for heavy-duty vehicles. My name is Tony Satterthwaite, and I'm the president of the distribution business at Cummins. Like you, we know climate change is a significant threat to our world and to our business. And Cummins has always been committed to improving technology in our industry. Today, I'd like to tell you a bit about that journey, as well as what we think may be possible in the future. First, let me tell you about Cummins. We're a 100-year-old company founded and headquartered in Columbus, Indiana. And in those 100 years, we've become the largest independent producer of both diesel engines and diverse power solutions in the world. In the United States, we have approximately 27,000 employees, and we have manufacturing facilities in 9 states. Because I have the opportunity to work with our customers every day, I see firsthand the challenges they face. Most of our customers buy heavy-duty vehicles for commercial return. A truck owner needs to be able to purchase a vehicle that is capable of doing the job required, has low operating costs, and can be purchased for a price that allows the truck owner to still make a profit at whatever work he or she is doing. Cummins doesn't make vehicles, but our engines and components are in many of the trucks you see on the road in a wide range of applications, including trucks and buses of all sizes. This is also another thing that makes the commercial vehicle sector unique. It is not one market. It is lots of markets with customers who need vehicles to do a wide variety of jobs. What is right for one customer won't necessarily be right for the next customer. Since the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, Cummins has been on a journey to reduce emissions from diesel engines. More than 30 years ago, we developed solutions that enable us to meet standards that reduce particulate emissions excuse me, in the diesel engine by 90% and NOx by 95% while improving fuel efficiency. In fact, it would take 60 of today's clean diesel trucks to equal the emissions from a single truck sold in 1988. But even with that progress, we don't believe we are done. Cummins and other truck and engine manufacturers are currently working with EPA and the California Air Resources Board about how much farther we can go to further reduce NOx and particulate matter. With respect to climate change, in 2009, Cummins began working with regulators to determine the best way to establish fuel efficiency standards for commercial vehicles, because improving fuel economy is the best way to reduce CO2 emissions from vehicles. We have always supported those standards, and truck and engine manufacturers like Cummins and other stakeholders are hard at work to develop products that meet these new standards. Department of Energy programs like SuperTruck are critical to develop the technologies to make that happen. Which brings me to where we are today. As we look to the future of the heavy-duty transportation sector, we don't believe there will be one technological solution that will meet all needs. While diesel technology has captured most of the commercial vehicle market in the past, we see a future where diesel, natural gas, Battery electric and even fuel cell and sustainable fuels power our products. How and where they are applied depends on a variety of factors, including technology capability, cost, and infrastructure availability, and frankly, we don't know which ones will win. We think clean diesel will remain an important technology for many of our customers for a long time. This is especially true for applications that require a lot of power and reliability. Of the alternatives to diesel, natural gas is the most mature, reliable solution available today that can reduce greenhouse gas, NOx, and particulate matter. Our latest natural gas engine is certified to California Air Resources Board optional low NOx emissions standard, which is 90% lower than current EPA and CARB 50-state standards. However, limited fueling infrastructure remains an important barrier to increased usage in many heavy-duty applications for natural gas. Cummins has also invested heavily in our electrified power. We have committed to investing $500 million and have launched our first battery electric powertrain this year in city and school bus applications. There are challenges to the adoption of battery technologies for the heavy-duty transportation sector. Improvements are needed in energy density, charging time, and infrastructure and cost. Continued investment by the Department of Energy can help us solve these issues faster. In addition to these technologies available today, Cummins is also investing in a variety of other fuels and technologies, including fuel cells powered by hydrogen and natural gas, and engines that can run on a variety of sustainable fuels. Cummins is committed to investing in an energy-diverse future where our customers have a broad portfolio of power options so they can choose what works best for them. Thank you for the great honor and privilege to speak to you today.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to move to members' questions. I'm going to hold off until probably closer towards the end, so I'd like to recognize Ms. Bonamici for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair Castor and Ranking Member Graves, and thank you to our witnesses. This is a good conversation we're having today. We know that the transportation sector is a large contributor of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, and we know that the hazardous air pollutants, particularly from diesel engines, disproportionately affect our vulnerable communities. In my home state of Oregon, they've recognized the public health risks of diesel trucks. The legislature just recently passed a bill to phase out older diesel engines with newer models by 2025 in the Portland metro area. And earlier this year, Daimler Trucks North America announced that it's going to begin manufacturing electric Freightliner trucks in Portland. They'll be on the road by 2030, and these are important first steps to help mitigate the pollution from heavy-duty vehicles. In Northwest Oregon, the district I'm honored to represent, our mass transit agency, TriMet, recently launched their first all-electric buses powered by 100% wind energy. TriMet estimates that the buses will reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 100 to 140 tons per year compared to their diesel fleet. The renewable-powered buses ease the congestion and reduce air pollution as they smoothly cruise through the Northwest. It's very exciting. The transition, of course, benefits the environment, but also the health and well-being of the communities. And I really encourage colleagues here today, you know, we heard about the costs, especially with things like buses. We need to consider as well the cost savings in terms of health care, job loss from people who are suffering from health conditions. So let's keep that in mind as we're crafting ideas and policies. Mr. Popple, you made several suggestions in your testimony about policy. What would be the best thing that Congress could do to incentivize the rapid deployment of zero-emission trucks and buses? And where do we need more research and development, investments in research and development as well to support our transition away from diesel to clean technologies?
Well, thank you, Congresswoman. I appreciate the question. I think the most
Could you push your microphone button, please?
I think the most important.
Oh, it just needs to be closer.
I think the most important thing that we can do is continue with the programs that already exist. So I would say the number one priority from my perspective would be to make sure that we have a long-term transportation bill, so a renewal of the FAST Act and continue the Lono program. The reason that's so important is because there are applications that are relatively easy to electrify, like city buses and school buses, and what we typically see in bus and truck is the technology starts in depot-based vehicles like buses, it's perfected, and then it's transferred to trucking. So we saw that with natural gas and with propane. I think we're going to see the same thing in electric. So if we want momentum towards zero-emission heavy-duty vehicles, I think it's important to keep the momentum we've already got on the applications where it makes sense today.
And do we need more research and development in any particular areas?
Absolutely. I think one of the new frontiers that we're eager to explore is this intersection between transportation and the grid. And the Department of Energy and the Department of Transportation should be seeking ways to create joint programs specifically around vehicle-to-grid technology.
Great.
These are big batteries, and they enable the grid to be more resilient. For example, after a storm or an earthquake or a fire, electric school buses or city buses could be putting power back onto a down grid. That technology still needs the research and development.
Terrific, thank you. Mr. Logan, I co-chair the bipartisan House Oceans Caucus, and I really appreciate your testimony mentioning that by 2050, ocean-going vessels alone will account for about 17% of emissions worldwide without significant efforts to decarbonize. And the electrification of the maritime industry is happening gradually. We know it's happening in Europe. Norway's kind of leading the way, but in the United States, we're falling behind our international allies. I represent a district that's bordered by the Columbia River and the Pacific Ocean. I invite you all to visit. It's beautiful. But I'm very concerned, obviously, about the effects of emissions from diesel-powered engines on our waterways and ecosystems. So what are the current barriers to electrifying the global shipping fleet, and how can we incentivize meaningful emissions reductions for the maritime industry?
Great. So I think the biggest obstacle is the fact that this is a sector that's regulated internationally. And so really having Congress urge our representatives that sit in those bodies to really step up and push the international community to advance technologies in ocean-going vessels. That, along with incentives, I think can move us in light years ahead of where we are today.
And I mentioned Norway. Are there other places that are really out in front in this transition?
I'd have to get back to you on that.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Armstrong, good morning. Ms. Miller, good morning. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Castor and Ranking Member Graves, and thank all of you all for being here today. The transportation industry in West Virginia is critical to ensure that our goods can make it across the nation and around the world. West Virginia has the 6th largest highway system in our country. My hometown of Huntington has one of the largest inland water ports in the nation. That, along with our trucks and our rail, help ensure that West Virginia natural resources are able to power the world. Mr. Satterthwaite, can you talk about what Cummins has done under the EPA Phase 1 greenhouse gas rule and what you plan on doing under Phase 2?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for the question. Cummins has worked collaboratively with the EPA over many years, starting in 2009. As I said, we were engaged with the development of the first round of Phase 1 greenhouse gas. We have now come to an agreement, the industry and EPA, on Phase 2 greenhouse gas, which will further lower greenhouse gas emissions of heavy-duty vehicles through 2027. These reductions are significant. Today's diesel engines are cleaner than ever, and through the latest generation of cleanest trucks on the road, we have reduced 59 million tons of CO2 has been eliminated since 2011 on the basis of improvements in diesel engine greenhouse gas emissions.
Can you discuss how Cummins has helped innovate in the heavy-duty transportation sector to increase energy diversity and help protect the environment?
Cummins, as I mentioned in my testimony, it has been investing in many technologies. We believe the best way to make short-term improvement in air pollution and greenhouse gas is to implement quickly improvements in diesel technology that have already been brought to market through programs like DERA and other programs that actually encourage customers to invest in newer vehicles and retire older vehicles. We've also made investments in battery electric and fuel cell technologies that we believe are a part of the future, and we continue to make those investments and believe there are parts of the commercial vehicle market where they are very appropriate and even economic at the current time.
So basically, you don't rely on just one type of technology.
That's correct, ma'am.
Okay. How would a technology forcing mandate hinder innovation in the heavy-duty sector?
A technology forcing mandate would require customers to use a technology that might not be appropriate for their specific application. And this is what we believe, that the commercial vehicle market, heavy-duty transportation sector, has a wide variety of customer needs, from long-haul over-the-road trucking to short-term pickup and delivery to the rail system. And we believe each of those applications in the future may benefit from a different technology, all with the intention of driving towards a cleaner and better future, but not all from a single technology.
Thank you. Does cost play a major role in businesses' decisions to utilize specific technology?
I believe so. I believe cost plays a major role, and I think all businesses consider cost, both OpEx, as we say, operating cost, and CapEx, capital cost. And some of the trade-offs we're talking about is the trade-off between capital cost and operating cost for every business.
So what other major factors that businesses rely upon when deciding which type of power is best to utilize?
In the customers that I work with, one of the first things that they worry about is reliability and support. Does the technology work? And when it doesn't, can I get it fixed quickly and easily and effectively? That is essentially what my part of the business at Cummins does. We repair products in the field, and it is a common conversation with customers and a concern they have. Again, they have business to do. They have work to do every day, and new technologies are interesting for them, but what they really want to do is reliably run their business.
Absolutely. What technology do you see the industry mainly relying upon in 10 years from now?
One of the things I like about the future is it's hard to predict. And at Cummins, we don't know. And so our approach has been to invest in a portfolio of technologies and to understand how each of those technologies, their relative benefits, their relative costs, and understand how the industry might evolve. We do not believe there will be a single technology winner in the future. Our view of the future of the heavy-duty transportation sector is it will be a multi-technology, multi-fuel industry in the future. And so we are trying to become a major player across that portfolio.
All of the above. Thank you so much. I give back my 5 whole seconds.
Thank you very much. Ms. Brownlee, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And before I begin, I wanted to ask unanimous consent that a copy of CalStart's federal policy, which has just come out, and their recommendations on medium and heavy-duty vehicles and calling for a national clean truck and corridor initiative, be added to the record.
Without objection?
Thank you. Mr. Popple, I wanted to thank you first for, at least in your written testimony, highlighting my Green Bus Act. I appreciate that very much. And I have a bill that says that any buses purchased with federal funds be zero emission by 2029. And it also increases funding for the low and no emission that you made reference to in your public testimony. So I thank you for that, and I hope that I could get members of the committee to sign on to my bill. In the staff report, and we have great staff, staff report states that while there are 300 electric transit buses in the United States, there are 2,250 electric transit buses in Europe and 421,000 electric buses in China. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think it's going to take in the United States to be a global leader? You made reference in your testimony that we have that opportunity to be a global leader. We seem to be terribly behind at the moment. But what is it going to take for us to truly be a global leader?
Well, thank you for the question. Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. I think the status of our progression towards more advanced technologies in the medium and the heavy-duty sector has a lot to do with our nation's traditional focus on the light-duty sector. So a lot of our policy early on and innovation early on was focused on cars. I think the U.S. has the best electric vehicle technology. We have the best battery technology. We have the best engineers, and we're just starting to apply that to the heavy-duty sector. I also think that other countries that have already done this demonstrate that there isn't technology risk or science risk in taking sectors like buses and completely electrifying them. We just need to focus on it and set tougher standards for emissions for those sectors like China and Europe have.
And with regards to CNG buses, I'm just curious. I know, Ms. Romero, you talked about our school buses. I was a school board member way back in the day, and I know that our fleet at that point in the early 2000s were transitioning to CNG buses from traditional diesel buses. Do we have any idea when we talk about our bus fleet, you know, what percentage is CNG? I understand that zero emissions is where we need to go, but there are somewhat cleaner buses out there than diesel buses, and just I don't have any sense of, in terms of school buses, you know, what percentage are CNG. I know that the federal government had offered some opportunities back in the early 2000s.
Yeah, I don't have the exact statistics for compressed natural gas buses, but I do know that out of the nearly 500 million school buses on the roads in the U.S., about 90% of those are run on diesel, so it's still very significant, and about 60 to 65% of our public buses.
In the cost comparison between an electric bus and a CNG bus, does anybody have any data on that?
It can still be about twice as expensive. Go ahead.
On the transit side, we see a basic diesel bus around $500,000. A CNG bus can be up to $600,000, and hybrids and electrics are $700,000 to $800,000.
Thank you. And Mr. Logan, in your testimony, you talked about the good things that are happening in Long Beach and LA, and bringing the environmental justice community together along with leadership in both cities. I also know that in the Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach, they have required that trucks utilizing the port meet certain clean emission standards, and they have progressively gotten stricter over time, and I think they've made some, you know, major improvements to that. Can you talk about, you know, lessons learned around that initiative and what the federal government could do to incentivize more of that? I have 11 seconds,
Great.
10
Absolutely.
seconds left.
So I think one is just coupling incentives with mandates through, for instance, at the ports of LA and Long Beach within their leases requiring the shippers to go to lower emission trucks and eventually to zero emission trucks. I think the lesson learned is that it was done, that we're able to do that the sky did not fall, that business continued to move forward, and there was profit to be made. And folks are actually being able to implement the program without any blips in the system.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Armstrong, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commodity-based economies like North Dakota, we like trucks, we like pipelines, we like rails, we like everything. We need the geographic distribution of agricultural products and natural resources and energy production necessitate the transportation of products to consumer states, New York, Texas, California, Oregon, from states that are production states. And as far as I know, we look at availability, reliability, and cost. We already suffer from a bigger basis differential on our agricultural products in North Dakota. We have a discount for transportation on oil, natural gas. And I think it's important that when we have this conversation, we talk about it, talk about it in the scenario of, we talk about all of the above energy, but we like all of the above transportation as well. So as we continue to do this and move forward, we also see repeated opposition to pipelines and rail transport, which are also necessary to move our products. Rail transport accounts for just over 2% of the global greenhouse gases. Pipelines are right around the same, just over 2%. But I mean, last month we passed an amendment on the floor of the House that essentially banned the transportation of liquefied natural gas by rail across this country. We constantly see different states across the country fighting against putting pipelines in the ground, and which is, regardless of how you feel about everything else, it's a cleaner, safer way to move a lot of this transportation. So, Mr. Satterwhite, what's the timeline for bringing heavy-duty electric vehicle technology to the market, specifically like Class 8 or higher? I mean, we're talking about buses, and I'm going to get into infrastructure if I have enough time, but I mean, we need to move heavy product, whether it's cows, grain, oil, natural gas.
I hope I'm not disappointing you by saying I don't know when.
No, I thought that would be the answer.
Currently, we see three major challenges to implementing battery electric technology in heavy-duty trucks. The first is energy density of batteries. Essentially, in order to have a tractor head that would have the same range and the same power as today's diesel engine and fuel tank, would need to increase by weight a factor of 3 to 5 in order to accommodate enough batteries to give that same power and that same range. And so that is both a cost and a weight penalty in the trucking industry. So improvements in energy density of batteries are one of the significant things that has to happen before battery electric technology can play a significant role in heavy-duty trucks.
Well, and I think that's important because we just talked about infrastructure and layout, but one of the things we have to talk about is road restrictions. And I mean, we talk about infrastructure packages, but those are borne by local, state, and county, counties when we do this. We had an oil boom in western North Dakota, had one of the largest infrastructure packages in our history, but one of the things we required western counties to do was to build up to bring their road weight to a higher threshold, so we didn't have to go back and fix every road 2 years later. I mean, there's always maintenance. But so when we're talking about that, I mean, this essentially moves the needle all across the country on road load. Am I right?
If you force electric technology into heavy-duty over-the-road trucks, then you will need to address all the other infrastructure, roads, weights, battery charging stations, and so there is an awful lot of impact on the infrastructure if you force a technology. I think, again, if you put a mandate out there that says we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, moving the same freight the same distance, the question is what other technologies are available and how can the market respond to that, including addressing infrastructure questions.
And I don't disagree with that, and I think it also includes, competition breeds low. The problem with all of this is eventually it gets passed on to the consumer. Farmers and ranchers have been doing this for 200 years, longer than that in my state, and they've never seen inputs go down. They've never seen the cost of transportation go down. And as we continue to bring this up, we talk about all of those things, but if we push this too fast at the same time as we're excluding other modes of transportation, then the cost of the producer and the cost of the consumer is going to go up.
I agree. It's this, in effect, instead of a technology forcing mandate, I think you're trying to warn against mode of transportation forcing mandates. And I do agree there are more efficient ways to move certain types of goods around the U.S. than the heavy-duty trucking industry. It has become very efficient, but there's no doubt there are more efficient ways to move certain commodities.
Yeah, depending on where you're trying to get them. Absolutely. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Neguse, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Today's topic is such an important aspect of the conversation around fighting climate change, given, as the Chair articulated, that the transportation sector really is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. There were a few references to the state of Colorado in the testimony. I happen to represent Colorado's 2nd Congressional District, and at the state level, I'm very proud that Colorado was the 11th state, the first landlocked state, to adopt the Zero Emission Vehicle, or ZEV, program following California's lead, which will ensure that 9% of vehicles sold in Colorado by 2025 are plug-in hybrid and electric. This rule alone is estimated to prevent 2.2 million metric tons of carbon dioxide and save our state $1.1 billion. At the federal level, I just want to note I'm very proud to support efforts happening in this chamber to drive down the transportation emissions as well. And in particular, I want to applaud the leadership of my good friend and colleague from California, Mr. Levin, for introducing the Zero Emission Vehicles Act, or the ZEV Act, and proud to be an original co-sponsor on that bill. Just to give you a sense of why this matters a great deal to me and to the folks that I represent, In my home state of Colorado, some folks might be familiar with the struggles we've had with respect to air quality. In the Denver metro area, Denver experiences what is known as a brown cloud, so a layer of smog over the city caused by weather patterns and local sources of pollution, including transportation. And just this past March, so just 3 months ago, Denver's air quality index at one point was at a level 3 times worse than Beijing. That is sobering and underscores the need for this committee and this Congress to take drastic and I think significant action and really show leadership on this front. And so again, appreciate the testimony of the individuals, the witnesses today, and appreciate your willingness to engage in this important conversation. Ms. Romero, I wanted to follow up on some of the points you made in both your written testimony and in your oral testimony. As reported by the IPCC in 2018, we only have 11 years to make drastic cuts in our emissions in order to avoid irreversible global consequences from climate change. You mentioned in your testimony the impact that tailpipe emissions and greenhouse gases have on children, negatively impacting their health and contributing to greater rates of asthma. With transportation as the #1 source of carbon emissions in the U.S., and the fact that 55% of K-12 students take a bus to school every day, there is a distinct need to eliminate the pollution our kids are exposed to when they ride diesel buses to school every day. You mentioned some of the efforts that have happened in my home state of Colorado on this front. I am curious if you could expound on the fact, on what you described in your testimony of ways in which we could further incentivize the electrification of diesel buses and other steps that you might recommend we take as a Congress.
Thank you for the question. You know, to mobilize the resources we need to make this transition, it's going to take a combination of public funding and private finance. Our partners at Clean Energy Works estimates that it would take $6 billion to cover the upfront cost barrier to electrify just 10% of the nation's school bus fleet over the next 5 years. So in short, we really need that combination of public funding and private financing. But it's possible, right? I heard another witness talk about, you know, making sure that there's a fair playing field for different types of fuels. We've been propping up the fossil fuel industry for decades. And Ms. Brownlee, you asked, you know, what's it going to take to be a global competitor? It takes investing in cutting edge technology. You know, when you have the iPhone 8 and 9 and 10, you don't want the iPhone 4, 5, and 6 anymore. We have the technologies here. We need to deploy these solutions. And so it's about equaling the playing field and helping school districts bridge the gap for that upfront cost so that they can benefit from the fuel and maintenance cost savings.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Romero, and thank you again to the witnesses today, and I would yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Palmer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Satterwhite, based on your experience with Cummings, do you think a single energy solution like going all electric will be able to meet the various needs of your customers?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. No, I do not.
Do you think consumers have some needs that are better served by traditional sources and some demands that are better served by electric? Is there some balance there?
I believe so, specifically today. As I've said a couple times, I think the future is uncertain, but today, I think there are certain applications where battery electric technology is capable, available, and economic, not all. How that changes over the future, I think, is what makes my life interesting and my day job very interesting. Will the right technology for the future be cleaner diesel, natural gas, fuel cells, battery electric? This is what we work on every day, and frankly, there isn't an answer right now.
We build CNG-powered trucks at Autocar in my district for trash trucks, and obviously their power demands for those type of trucks are smaller than some of our bigger freight transfer trucks. And I do have some concerns about this effort to go to 100% renewable and how that would impact not only the reliability of the system, but also the cost for electric vehicles. It's not free.
It is not free, and I would say that the customers that I talk to share those concerns. Most of the customers I speak with have an interest in figuring out how to get to a lower carbon, a lower polluting operation of their own. and yet they're also worried about, is the technology ready? Is it appropriate for them? And in the meantime, we in the industry continue to make improvements to the diesel engine, improvements to the natural gas engine, which continue to take carbon out of the air and reduce pollution on an annual basis through working with the EPA and CARB.
Well, it's not going to completely remove carbon from even if we go to 100% renewables and 100% electric vehicles, it's not going to completely remove carbon from the atmosphere. I want to talk about another aspect of this, and I think Congressman Armstrong touched on it a little bit, and that is the weight aspect of this. And I'm concerned about going to pilotless vehicles and how that's going to impact our infrastructure, because most of us, and I know nobody in this room texts while they drive, but even if you're not distracted, you're varying your position in a lane. You change lanes, but even if you stay in the same lane, you don't stay in the same spot. If we add to the weight of freight vehicles and we go to pilotless vehicles, they're going to be in one spot, and it's going to basically rut the aggregate that we're now using. Do you see that as an issue, a problem, particularly in your industry?
Sir, I'm afraid you may have gotten out of my area of expertise in terms of trucks and roads. I don't know. I think to the earlier Congressman's comment, I do think the infrastructure of this country, the roads in particular, will need to be addressed, and heavier trucks definitely will have an impact at some point. I am not an expert and really able to comment on exactly how that's going to happen.
It's something that I've been focused on, I've been working on down at Auburn University. They've got a center where they're testing various types of aggregate. They've got a big test track. And one of the interesting things is that one of my concerns is how do we clean up the coal ash, and they're using coal ash now as part of the aggregate. You don't lose any of the heavy metals. They don't leach into the ground, but it hardens the asphalt, and I think that's going to be a big deal. As of today, and this will be my last question, there are more than 30 counties in California that are out of compliance with not just one, but multiple federal air quality standards in the Clean Air Act, despite all of the regulations that California has in place. There are numerous other California counties that are in violation of one of the air quality standards, and many have been out of compliance for decades, and it's unclear when, if ever, some will come into compliance. For reference, Alabama does not have a single county out of compliance. So my question would be, does it make sense to apply more regulations to the transportation industry when that doesn't appear to be working in heavily regulated states like California? And this is EPA data here, I have here.
I think it's a responsibility of industry, and Cummins sees it as a responsibility of industry to continue to improve technology, to have better outcomes for all American citizens. I do think there is scope, and the EPA is appropriate to continue to push the industry on what it's capable of, and asking us to deliver better for the American people across the country.
Be smarter. I yield back.
Mr. Huffman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a great conversation. I want to thank the witnesses and thank the chair for setting this up. And I'm interested in the technology we're talking about. Those of us who think we're in a climate crisis, many of us believe we've got to start identifying areas in which we simply don't need to burn fossil fuel because we have alternative technology that can help us move forward. And what I'm trying to understand, and I want to start with you, Mr. Satterthwaite, because you're really at the fulcrum of these heavy vehicles that have always relied on internal combustion and fossil fuels, is whether we can reimagine that technology in a way that doesn't burn fossil fuel. And I'm not talking about natural gas, because as I take a look at that, I don't think we have time for fake solutions. And quite honestly, if you, yes, it has less of a carbon profile on the burning end of the system, but if you add in the fugitive methane, which we think is somewhere between 1% and 9%, at 3.5% methane loss, it's just as bad as coal. So if we're serious about this crisis, we've got to identify places where we don't need to use fossil fuel and move on to new clean technologies. Can we do that with the type of heavy vehicles that you have been such a leader in working on? If we decide that we've just got to go beyond fossil fuel to clean technology. And let me just say that I've worked with Cummins in the past. When I was a California legislator, I know your innovators. Worked with a division of yours called Clear that did these wonderful retrofit devices for school buses that dramatically reduce the particulate matter. So I'm impressed with your track record in this area. Just want to hear your thoughts on whether we can reimagine this technology.
Thank you, Congressman. I will say that much of Clear's work was funded by the DERE Act, so I just want to make sure you knew that that's how that work was done in California. I would argue Cummins is reimagining the future. If you look across the industry, last year the first company to show an electric truck was Cummins. And so we are currently trying to do exactly that. Imagine what a future would look like in a very different state. And part of the challenge, of course, is we're trying to do this economically at both a capital cost and an operating cost level. So we are asking ourselves all those questions. We strongly believe the future will be multi-technology. It won't be a single technology. And the path to get there, we will need to make improvements today and in the future. And I think what I don't want to miss is the opportunity to make improvements today in light of trying to make, go for gold, if you will, with zero emissions in the future and ignore the opportunity to make significant emissions reductions today.
But I think I'm hearing you say there's nothing about these heavy vehicles and heavy equipment that you've been powering that precludes going to fossil-free technology.
At a certain point of time, at a certain cost, at a certain reliability, but the technology is developing. I would argue to say it is not fully developed, but it is developing, and there are many forces in the industry that are pushing it, and Cummins is also with those forces moving it along as well.
Appreciate that. Mr. Popple, the other concern I have about this climate crisis is that we're way behind some other countries that seem to be taking it much more seriously. We've seen the numbers on electric buses. China is light years ahead of us on deploying this technology. I recently took a trip to Sweden as part of the Transportation Infrastructure Committee. They're reimagining their highway system to address some of the limitations of electrifying heavy trucks, and they're piloting some charge-as-you-drive technologies where the actual transportation infrastructure of the country would help solve the problem of battery density and battery weight. What can we do in this country to reclaim the mantle of leadership in this crisis when we talk about heavy vehicles like buses and trucks?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I think we really should focus on economic productivity and return to that being the focus of the investments we make. I think there's a false trade-off that's depicted between clean innovation and economic efficiency. On the bus side, on an apples-to-apples basis, if you power a bus with an electric system, you use 2,000 watt-hours per mile. If you use diesel, you use 10,000 watt-hours per mile. So those countries that have already moved past legacy technologies in some of their transportation systems, they have 8,000 watt-hours per mile of free economic value to put into a data center or put into industry. The other thing I would mention is that from a lightweighting perspective, some of the sectors are already getting there where the electric vehicle is at the same weight or lighter than the combustion vehicle. So a Proterra battery electric bus with a carbon fiber body is lighter than a CNG bus. So as long as we make sure, as my colleague pointed out, that the technologies are ready to go and have reached product market fit, there are huge economic productivity gains to be had.
Great. Thank you. Yield back.
Mr. Carter, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank all of you for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor and privilege of representing the 1st Congressional District of Georgia, which includes the whole coast of Georgia. It's over 100 miles of pristine coastline, and it includes 2 major seaports, the Port of Savannah, which is the 2nd busiest port, container port, on the eastern seaboard, as well as the Port of Brunswick, which is the #2 roll-on, roll-off port in the country. The Port of Savannah is one of the fastest growing ports in the world. In fact, for a short period of time there, they were the 3rd fastest growing port in the world. Only 2 ports in China were growing faster. I mention that because obviously they're growing at a very high rate of speed, but they are also taking great initiatives in saving fuel. In fact, the Georgia Ports Authority has saved over 2 million gallons of fuel annually just by electrifying their ship-to-shore cranes. And if you take all of the initiatives together, they are saving nearly 7 million gallons of fuel annually, which is significant particularly for these growing ports. And One of their most critical benefits is that they have 2 first-class railroads right there on the ports in the container port in Savannah, which really helps tremendously. You know, one of the initiatives, if you will, that the President has spoken about and that we in Congress have been speaking about is the infrastructure initiative, and certainly that's very important. I'll direct this question to you, Mr. Satterthwaite, but at the same time, anyone chime in here. Improving our infrastructure, particularly improving our roads and bridges, how would that make heavy-duty vehicles more efficient and, in turn, more cleaner?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I think the impact of infrastructure, particularly roads and bridges on the heavy-duty industry, I think is in a couple of areas. One is that the sad state of our roads leads to more breakdowns and more customers who face interruptions to their business because, frankly, who of us hasn't driven over a pothole and popped a tire in someplace? And if you're driving a 18-wheeler rig, that's not only dangerous, it also stops that load and interrupts that wheel of commerce from moving. So making improvements will, initially at least, improve the efficiency with which goods move across the U.S. I think then the next step is then what it enables us to do and how we use those investments. There are some countries around the world who are investing, as the Congressman said, in Sweden about changing how they think about the infrastructure. If you're upgrading it, I believe we may as well think long-term and ask ourselves what other types of improvements would we put in the infrastructure rather than just replacing what is there. How do we build for the future? So I think both those opportunities both those activities have big opportunity to improve the efficiency of our industry.
Great. Well, let me mention that I was also on that trip to Sweden and witnessed the same thing that Jared witnessed, and it is very innovative and certainly something we need to be looking at. I want to also mention about my district. Obviously, I'm very proud of the district, but it also has a large rural area. South Georgia, rural South Georgia, is a large geographic area, and I believe some of my colleagues up here mentioned also about the effect that this might have on rural areas, and I want to make sure the rural areas aren't left behind. I want to make sure that they're included because, you know, they have. Make sure they have a seat at the table because they have a big need for these heavy-duty vehicles, and how can we help them? What kind of challenges do you see? And again, I'll direct this to anyone who wants to jump in, but what kind of challenges do you see the rural communities having when compared to the urban cities and reducing emissions?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just jump in here. Thank you for the question. Based on my experience in working in some of the rural communities in California, you know, a lot of these communities don't have access really to local hospitals or even just government services to do their regular business, you know, update and renew their driver's license and all that sort of thing, right? Because the metropolitan areas are so far away. And so in Huron, California, where my friend Ray Leon is the mayor, there's a 7,000 person town that takes 4 hours for them just to get to the nearest public hospital because they've got to take 3 buses. That's 4 hours one way. It takes 4 hours back. What hour do you schedule your doctor appointment, right? So we do need to invest in public transportation in these areas and bringing buses to these areas. I'm sure that there are some rural communities where the range will be more of a challenge, right? But in Huron, what they're doing now is electric rideshare programs that the community has led to help connect people to services with clean vehicle technology that doesn't pollute these areas.
Well, thank you very much for your answer, and I do hope that we will remember the rural communities. This is extremely important for them as well. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. McEachin, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for holding this hearing today, and I'm grateful to all the witnesses for coming today. As we've discussed, the transportation sector is now the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, and auto emissions powerfully affect air quality and public health. Air pollution and climate change, both direct effects of tailpipe emissions, affect all Americans, but they disproportionately impact low-income communities, communities of color, and other vulnerable populations. Protecting these communities from dangerous air pollution and from the worst impacts of climate change is a moral imperative. I want to use my time to explore how we can best meet that responsibility. And Mr. Logan, sir, if you don't mind, I'll start off with you. Mr. Logan, environmental injustices in general and disparities in air pollution exposure in particular are a direct result of poor policymaking, and they cry out for a policy solution. For instance, I have the honor of sponsoring legislation to ensure that the federal government considers the true impact of greenhouse gas emissions in a cost-benefit analysis. I believe that when we talk about the cost of fighting climate change, we also need to consider the public health costs of doing nothing. What might the full and fair accounting look like in practice? How can Congress promote it? And how can we ensure that we are mindful not just of how much good we do, but also whom we help?
Great, thank you. So first I want to say that action needs to be taken, and action needs to be taken now. We know that we are in a climate crisis, and so action definitely needs to be taken. There is costs to transitioning to zero emissions for sure, but there are costs to the impacts of the climate crisis, whether that's in agriculture or whether that's in public health in our communities. It's paramount that we look at resourcing communities that are disproportionately impacted. One of the reasons that we have the impacts in these communities is because that's where the activities are, that's where the operation is in port and freight communities specifically. So when we look at environmental justice, climate justice through that lens and through the lens of equity, we need to make sure that we're investing in these communities to uplift them and so that we can transition in a smart and just way.
Thank you. Ms. Romero, in your testimony, you mentioned that vehicle pollution is linked with asthma. Childhood asthma, of course, is the top reason for missed school days nationwide. It can significantly affect children's quality of life and, in rare cases, can prove fatal. What is the best way for Congress to protect children from this harmful pollution, and how do we ensure that the benefits are concentrated in the communities that suffer the most?
Yeah, look, African Americans are 3 to 4 times more likely to be hospitalized and die from asthma. And I think, what it's going to take, I heard Mr. Carter and other members really speak about the progress that we've made on cleaner fuels and, making steps forward with a sense of pride, and I could feel that. I think, though, if anyone's watched a game of basketball, when you've made the shot, and you're sitting there holding your hands up after you've made the shot, being proud, and you stand there just a little too long, the rest of the team has already taken the ball and scored on you, right? So I think that I just want us to remember that we should be proud for the progress that we've made, but we've got a whole heck of a lot further to go, especially on the timeline that the IPCC report is telling us. And so we really need to accelerate and invest significant resources.
I like the analogy, thank you. Mr. Papel, I've heard people say that electric vehicles are only for wealthy individuals. Can you explain why people who do not own cars should be interested in the electrification of transportation and how even they would benefit from this trend?
Well, thank you for the question, Congressman. One of the reasons why I first got involved with Proterra after starting my career in electric vehicles at Tesla Motors was that I saw the opportunity in the fleet vehicle sector for us to deploy clean electric vehicle technology into the most accessible form of transportation. So there are vehicle categories, specifically public transit buses and city buses, that are predominantly utilized by lower income families. But we should also not forget about the fact that whether you own a vehicle or not, you're paying the health cost of the truck or bus or car that drives past you. So I actually think that some of the best applications for EV go into the most utilitarian types of vehicles.
Thank you for your answer. And Madam Chair, I am now giving you 10 seconds back. I yield back.
Terrific. The ranking member is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Logan, let me ask you a question. You're in charge of climate for the whole country. We give you $1 billion. What do you do?
It's going to take a lot more than $1 billion, right? And it's going to take all of us.
Mr. Logan, what do you do?
So I would say, to the same point, $1 billion is a significant amount of money, but we definitely need to go beyond that globally and in the United States. But couple that, really feeding that into incentive programs, couple it with regulatory measures. I think that gets us
incentive programs to do what?
To deploy zero-emission vehicles, especially in the heavy-duty sector. I think to the point that not one particular technology is going to get us to where we need to be. Zero emissions is definitely needed. We definitely need to move towards zero emissions, whether that's fuel cell or other types of technology. But there is a cost to doing nothing, right? And electric vehicles is over 100-year-old technology. We've gotten, over 10 years ago, we put a robot on Mars. We can do this. We have the technology, we have the know-how, and we have the innovation. Again, with regulatory measures, backed up with incentive programs, we can get there.
And if I can add, as important as the what is the where and the who. And so I would take that $1 billion and I would prioritize underserved and pollution-burdened communities, whether urban, rural, et cetera, so that we can help these clean technology companies actually break through the market barriers. It's easy for the early adopters. It's easy for the rich guys on the coasts, right, to afford a Tesla as a toy car. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a green economy that benefits every American all across the country, starting with those who need it most.
You know, the thing that just, it's fascinating to me. I heard, Mr. Popple, you said that we need to look at economic productivity. And the way that I view that is we have to do economic analysis. What's the best bang for the buck? What is the best return on investment for the tax incentives we're providing, for the R&D dollars, for all of the capital investments and incentives that we're providing? And I hear people sitting here just saying zero emissions heavy trucks is what we need to do. When I'm not sure that, look, we have a finite amount of cash. We have a finite amount of incentives that we can do. And I want to make sure that we're investing our dollars and our limited resources in the incentives and in the products that are actually going to generate the best solutions. And I heard my friend Mr. Huffman. Mr. Huffman, you're still here? Good. You said, and I wrote it down, so it's going to come back up at Resources Committee, I promise. We don't have time for fake solutions. Mike, count on it. It's coming back up. And you also talked about China and how you said China's beating us. But look, I think it's important for us to talk about the fact, look, the United States, we have reduced emissions by nearly 1 billion tons. China has increased during that same period of time 4 billion tons. Like, so I'm not sure what they're beating us on. They're not. We had a hearing in T&I committee on BYD. They're beating us on stealing our technology. That's what they're beating us on. They're beating us on an undercutting domestic companies like Mr. Popple right here that are trying to employ American jobs and not have state-owned enterprises that are coming in and distorting the economics. Let me, Mr. Satterthwaite, let me ask you a question. You laid out a chart, and it's interesting. You have clean diesel, natural gas, electric. You talk about how you have these extraordinary reductions. And to throw out one other figure that's in your testimony, you talk about the Phase 2 greenhouse gas standards for commercial vehicles. When fully implemented, those standards will lower CO2 emissions by approximately 1.1 billion metric tons. That the United States, I said that we've reduced our emissions by 1 billion tons. That is greater than the next. I used to say 11, now it's 12. 12 countries combined. Why is it, Mr. Satterthwaite, that you don't see all these companies just coming to you and just saying, hey, I want electric trucks? Why is that not happening?
I think, thank you for the question, Congressman. I think that customers are concerned. Most of our customers are conservative in their business approach. They want to invest in products and particularly in products that they are confident are going to work for them and help their business be successful. And I think the two biggest concerns about electric heavy-duty trucks right now are weight, which is a function of battery density, range, which is also a function of energy density of batteries, and then reliability and charging infrastructure. Imagine you're a truck company, you buy an electric truck to do business in LA, and that truck needs to go to Reno, Nevada. And there's no charging station in Reno, or that there is a charging station that takes 8 hours to charge that truck. So what does the driver do for those 8 hours? So these are practical concerns that our customers have about infrastructure, about technology readiness, and also about cost.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I want to say that, look, when we move forward, I agree with what all of our objectives here are. I agree. We need to be careful. Russia and Massachusetts have to import gas, excuse me, let me try that again. New York and Massachusetts had to import gas from Russia. California has had to increase their oil imports from Saudi Arabia and others. And as we talked about the other day, the electrical grid is going to require 2 to 3 times the electricity to move to EV vehicles in this new economy. We need to make sure that we're planning in a way that actually allows us to achieve these goals with current technology. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Caston, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair Castro, and to all our panelists. Really appreciate y'all coming here today. You know, I think I won't belabor the point. A lot of people have mentioned how the transportation sector is now the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. My view is that that is in no small part because it really requires a different set of policies than other sectors. The electric sector, the industrial sector are dominated by capital-intensive assets that run most of the time. The operative question in those sectors is what's the variable cost of energy. The transportation sector is dominated by capital-intensive assets that are parked most of the time. And the operative question is what is the cost of capital in that space? And I think sometimes we assume that we can do the same tools everywhere, but they're not the same tools. However, I would submit to you that the principles that have to guide good climate policy are the same everywhere. And I really liked your comments, Mr. Satterthwaite, when you called for technology-neutral and goal-dependent decarbonization strategies in the transportation sector. I would suggest that that is true everywhere. To Mr. Graves' point, we do have finite capital. Markets will allocate capital accurately and efficiently if we define the goal. We get in our way all the time when we start recommending paths. And there's also the reality that lowering carbon dioxide emissions is awesome, fun, and addictive once you start. Because, and this is complicated, so I'm going to say this real slow so everybody gets it, people don't give away fuel for free. So if you burn less fuel, you save money. That requires an investment, but you make money on investments. And in places that have done this, we've seen them adopt this and move along and go from there. And that is essential to make sure that our climate policies focus on accelerating capital investment and then recognize that once you own an efficient vehicle, once you own an efficient power plant, once you own a solar panel on your roof, you tend to operate it all the time because it's cheaper, it's more efficient, and if you're fortunate enough to own an electric car, it's super fun to drive. Way more fun than that other car you got. So, you know, that's in part why I introduced HR 2025 to permanently extend the alternative fuel refueling property tax credit for investments in EV charging and other alternative fuel. This is a real hard investment for the private sector to make. But once you get that infrastructure out there, it's a catalyst to move other investments forward. I want to thank Chairman Neal and Chairman Thompson for including an extension of that tax credit in the Taxpayer Certainty and Disaster Relief Act of 2019. Mr. Popple, as we consider a potential infrastructure package, can you help understand why it's important that the federal government make investments in EV charging infrastructure?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. I think certain types of EV charging infrastructure require federal investment because you've got a period of underutilization for infrastructure, and so you end up with a market failure. It's difficult for a private business to have patient enough capital, and you've also got to be able to take a little bit of risk for some of those charging stations in terms of knowing where to put them. However, on the fleet vehicle side, what I think is quite interesting is that there's no risk in terms of where that infrastructure should go and whether or not it will be economically utilized. That's one of the reasons why we've never had a charging infrastructure problem with our market. We don't have a chicken and egg problem because our customers buy the same number of chickens and the same number of eggs as they need to do that fleet vehicle job. I agree also with your point on the fact that once you get started with this technology, you embrace it and you want to go further with it. We've had dozens of cities throughout the U.S. voluntarily on their own from the bottoms up. After they've implemented some electric buses, they have passed an action plan to go to 100% electric buses. So for some sectors where the category is ready, once you get it started, it takes a momentum on its own and the customer will take it from there.
Thanks. So I want to shift. Since its inception in 2007, the Advanced Technology Vehicle Manufacturing Program has helped drive a whole lot of investment through direct loans to automotive or component manufacturers for re-equipping, expanding, or establishing facilities for the domestic production of fuel-efficient advanced technology vehicles. I think the numbers to date are supported over 4 million advanced technology vehicles and upwards of $17.7 billion in remaining loan authority. However, a 2018 report from Energy Future Initiative entitled Leveraging the DOE Loan Program notes that current statutes prevent the program funds from being used to invest in medium and heavy-duty vehicles, even though they account for almost 25% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector. Madam Chair, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter this report into the record. Mr. Popple, I was pleased to hear you call to amend the program to allow companies like Proterra to be able to apply for loans. Would welcome from you and/or Mr. Satterthwaite, as you think about low-carbon solutions in the transportation sector, how important is it that the federal government provide access to lower-cost financing options?
Well, I think it can be extremely important in terms of starting a market, but what we've seen on the battery electric bus side is once it's proven out, private capital steps in. So we had a recent example where Mitsui has announced a $200 million program to finance batteries for our sector, but you often need the federal government to at least initiate it.
Mr. Satterthwaite?
I would support Mr. Popple. I think starting and getting some of these early starts and early wins in the infrastructure, charging infrastructure, and alternate fuel refueling infrastructure is an area where the federal government can play a very big part.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Madam Chair, would you entertain a unanimous consent request, please? A report from the Rhodium Group and also a recent E&E News report. This is, unfortunately, in response to my friend Ranking Member Graves' victory lap on our recent emissions reductions. The victory lap is over, and these reports show that in 2018 our emissions began rising again. They're projected to continue rising. So sadly, we don't have a lot of laurels to rest on, and I think these reports, if you'll enter them into the record, will help correct that impression.
Without objection. And Mr. Lujan, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Popple, you said that the next wave of transportation technology isn't just about driving down emissions, but also, I quote, creating good-paying jobs and boosting the clean energy economy. Proterra could be a model for growing the manufacturing of heavy-duty vehicles in the country with an eye toward reducing emissions and protecting working men and women. Are you working with communities and unions to hire family-supporting jobs that reduce emissions?
Absolutely, Congressman. I appreciate the question. We work very closely on the infrastructure side with labor groups like the IBEW. They tend to be one of the best sources of high-voltage trained, skilled labor. We are a young manufacturer. We have about 500 employees, so we're still evolving through what our long-term structure will be in terms of our relationship with labor, but we are supportive 100% of whatever decision our employees make in terms of their right to organize. We have a plant in Greenville, South Carolina. We have a plant in LA County, and we also have a plant in the Bay Area, and we're supportive of whatever our employees choose. In terms of good jobs and a clean energy economy, our company provides salary, health care benefits, stock equity in the company for 100% of our employees, and we think the types of jobs that we're creating for this company can be a model for this new industry as it grows and helps us improve our energy productivity.
I appreciate that response, Mr. Popple. My father was a union iron worker. He learned how to weld in the shipyards of San Pedro as a young man before he found his way back to New Mexico. My brother's IBEW. My grandfather was a union carpenter as well. The other question that I have connected to that, and you alluded to this, but what are you doing also within the company to promote safe working conditions and to make sure that, well, we are moving forward with what will be strong new technological advances, that people are smart about the environments that they're creating for the teams that you're assembling to build the future?
That's a great question. Thank you, sir. The reality is working on electric vehicles and maintaining electric vehicles and operating electric vehicles is healthier for the worker than the fossil fuel alternative. A lot of our service techs, one of the things they really like about this job is at the end of the day, they're not covered in grease and oil. They don't feel like they're going back home to their families, possibly with something on them that's a contaminant. In terms of work environment, Proterra as a company exceeds our industry averages for safety. We start every meeting, every session with a focus on safety, including with our board of directors. And we take very seriously the need to train workers on this new digital and electric technology, not just on the vehicle side, but also on the infrastructure side.
I appreciate that. And you anticipated my next question was, how can we work with you to promote the skill and labor force needed, specifically in the electric vehicle service and maintenance workers and battery technicians? So I appreciate that very much. Mr. Romero, I represent a rural district in New Mexico. What more can we be doing to promote electric vehicles and clean transportation infrastructure in districts like mine?
Yeah, you know, electric vehicle infrastructure, charging stations, right, are going to be put in neighborhoods where they think there's going to be a lot of electric vehicle ownership. And whether it comes to bringing these technologies to rural communities or bringing them to urban communities of color, the problem is the same. We need to make sure that we're investing in accessible, clean technology for all Americans. And sometimes that means a utility or a company isn't going to put it there. It doesn't make a business sense for them. But for us, as a government that serves all Americans across the United States, we need to make sure that we're filling that gap and providing fair access.
So in states like New Mexico, where a lot of trucks are moving through there, there's a lot of long haul. So our interstate systems are probably the first areas that could benefit from that infrastructure investment as it then builds out away from those interstate systems into maybe vehicles that aren't going to be on such long hauls. What are you doing in that space?
Yeah, so I mentioned this a little bit earlier. There's a small town, farm worker town in Central California, Huron. It's a 7,000 person town. This is a community that takes 4 hours on 3 different public buses just to get to the nearest children's hospital. That's one way. It's an 8-hour round trip. And of course, the buses don't run at night. As you know, in rural communities, the infrastructure is lacking. And so what they're doing is they have this Green Reauthorize program where there's electric rideshare, community-owned. If you think a Zip car led by communities where people can come in and use an electric vehicle to get to their appointments or use an electric vehicle to provide service for other members of the community. A lot of retired community members come in and do that. They work or they volunteer as a driver, and they're able to bring that technology in and help solve some of those gaps.
I appreciate that, Madam Chair. I appreciate the emphasis in that community as well with the challenges they have for transportation. If they don't have a rural health care clinic, I think that's something else that we could look at, making sure those folks have access to. But when you talk about a town of that size, you're talking about communities where I come from, so I get it, and I appreciate your work in that space, Mr. Romero. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Levin, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Castro. I'm very grateful that you're holding this hearing. This is a personal issue for me, having grown up near a major port, the Port of Long Beach, for the first 8 years of my life before we moved down to South Orange County. And I have 3 big ports in Southern California, in Long Beach, LA, and San Diego. And I'm friends with a lot of the folks there. I've had a chance to tour the Middle Harbor initiative at Port of Long Beach and see all the zero-emission things that are going on. And I commend all of you, all 4 of you, and that includes anybody trying to do zero emission, as you are at Proterra. I'm also encouraged by the work being done at Cummins with the Cummins Westport engine. The reality is that we need to get to zero. When I say zero, I don't just mean criteria pollutants. I think that's great. I think those advances are really critical on NOx, SOx, particulate matter. But the reality is we've got to get to zero, period. That means zero CO2 as well. We've got to get there as quickly as we can. I think it's important also to note that a lot of the work that we're doing on the light-duty side, as we work to build out a EV charging infrastructure throughout the state of California in particular, which I'm most familiar with, we're going to go from 14,000 EV chargers to 250,000 EV chargers by 2025. I have a bill that would increase the sales of new passenger cars to be 50% of all new passenger cars in California by 2035, and it ramps up, or in the nation, ramps up from there. We're already doing this stuff in California. I'm always mindful of where are you going to get that electricity from, because I hear the naysayers say, well, if the electricity is dirty, then the electric vehicles are going to be dirty. Right now we're getting, and this is our handy ISO app in California, 52% of all of our electricity in California is coming from renewable sources. That's right now today. I'm also mindful that fuel cells could play a big role in this as well in the heavy-duty space. I worked in clean energy for about 15 years, representing a variety, everybody from electric trucks to fuel cells. And there's strengths and weaknesses to each of those technologies. There are infrastructure hurdles to each of those technologies as well. And I wanted to just highlight the work we're doing in California, again, with regard to heavy duty. Specifically, Port of Long Beach just got an $8 million grant from the CEC to construct hydrogen refueling infrastructure. Port of LA got $41 million last year from the California Air Resources Board for the similar hydrogen fueling infrastructure, use of zero emissions forklifts and the like. So we've made it a priority in California. And the question for each of you is, what can we do at the federal level? I've seen a variety of suggestions, but what one thing would you like to see us do at the federal level to really advance zero emissions heavy duty infrastructure?
If I may, Congressmember, so if I was just to pick one today, I think investing in DERA program, specifically within a program looking at the freight sector, advancing zero emissions, using the example of the school bus rebate program, and alter that to look like a rebate system for zero emission technology in the freight sector.
Thank you. Anybody else? Because we get to write laws up here.
Yeah, the short thing I mentioned was the Clean School Bus Act for school bus electrification. The other thing that I think is a big topic of discussion, potentially in a bipartisan way, is carbon pricing. And I think so far there's no carbon pricing legislation at the federal level that is looking at how we leverage the revenue to accelerate the transition. And I would say any revenue neutral option is not an option. So thinking about how do we leverage those dollars to deploy into solutions that are going to get us to zero emission.
Okay.
So I'd have two quick ones, Congressman. One would be to open the ATVM program, which has funding to medium and heavy-duty vehicle. The fact that ATVM excludes anything but a car shows how car-centric and focused we've been to our misfortune. And the second one would be is I would aggressively invest in modernizing the power grid, because we don't know exactly when all these different sectors are going to go electric, but we do know the low-carbon common currency fuel of the future is electricity. And the more we invest in the grid, the more we can get clean energy out of Texas or Iowa or Northern California or Southern California into other sectors from Oregon. So any investment in the grid, I think, is a future-proof investment.
It's almost like we need to pass an infrastructure bill.
Absolutely.
Yes, sir.
I just add funding DERA, continuing to fund DERA, and let customers choose which way to reduce emissions, and do it with short and long-term benefits.
I wanted to ask a related question, perhaps each of you could just briefly weigh in. We have an opportunity with the USMCA, the new NAFTA. And when I think about air quality and emissions in my region, the greater San Diego region, it seems to me heavy-duty transit, a lot of trucks coming to and from Mexico certainly contribute. What, if anything, should we be doing in the new NAFTA about heavy-duty emissions?
I would say without a doubt, including in any type of agreement, a clean truck and clean freight mandate. The communities in and around those ports of entry are dramatically impacted, and I think this is one of the ways in which we can look at the cost of doing business to help to be solution-oriented, addressing both environmental justice and climate justice.
Appreciate it. I'm out of time, and I appreciate the chair. If one more wants to answer this, and I'm really out of time.
Go ahead.
I could just quickly. Canada has essentially followed U.S. EPA regulations for heavy-duty trucks, so there is already harmonization between the U.S. and Canada. Mexico has followed European standards, not U.S. standards. They are not that different, but there could be an argument. Harmonization would be better, I think, as part of MCA, if we could harmonize heavy-duty emissions regulations across the historic NAFTA USMCA. I think that could make a difference.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Before we go to Mr. Griffith, I'll recognize the ranking member for a UC request.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I can't tell you how much it pains me to submit anything that may refute what Mr. Huffman said, but I just want to ask unanimous consent to submit a report, July 2019 report by EIA that demonstrates that 2019 they're expecting emissions to have a net reduction of 2.2%, which I believe would be lower than the majority of years during the Obama administration.
Just a question, is this in the electricity generation sector, or does it include the transportation sector?
Yeah, that's energy-related CO2 emissions.
So It's coal, natural gas, petroleum. So this is likely in the electric power sector, not the transportation sector? Or is it all sectors?
This is energy related. It's my understanding that it is tied back to all sectors that use those fuels.
You beat me to it, Madam Chair. I think if allowed enough time, I could track down another unanimous consent to show 2019 emissions are rising.
Bring it, bring it.
Thank you all very much. Without objection, and Mr. Griffith, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me apologize to you and the other members of the committee and to our witnesses. I've been often a hearing where we're working on fentanyl and trying to keep it from coming into the U.S. So I apologize, but it's not that I've been out doing fun things. I've been working hard for the people of the United States. Mr. Cummins, Mr. Satterthwaite, Cummins is a leader in the ultra-low emission natural gas engines. How have these natural gas engines helped reduce carbon emissions in the heavy-duty transportation world?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Congressman. As I mentioned in my testimony, our latest low-emissions natural gas engine is actually achieving emissions levels which are 90% below the EPA and CARB heavy-duty diesel standards. Natural gas usage is primarily limited to return-to-base fleets, city buses, refuse trucks, other fleets that are on a regular return-to-home basis because of the challenges with natural gas infrastructure. There is just not enough fueling infrastructure to allow natural gas to extend into the line haul over-the-road trucks. What we have been able to reduce in the natural gas engines is significant. On a horsepower for horsepower basis, natural gas is somewhere between 30% lower greenhouse gas generation than diesel for the same amount of work done. And so those engines have made a significant difference in the communities they've been in. Most of them are in rural areas and with municipal fleets, in urban areas and with municipal fleets. And so that's made a significant difference, we believe, in those communities.
Now, I support an all-of-the-above approach, but I have expressed concerns in the past about electric vehicles and that I think maybe government policy has tipped the scales and we haven't researched enough on other fuels, which is why I ask about natural gas, because I'm very interested in that. So then the question becomes on electric trucks, and I know a lot of companies, including Volvo, which its North American headquarters is in my district, is working on an electric truck. Don't we currently have the same problem with over-the-road trucking that we would have with electric trucks as we would with natural gas?
I think if you say the same problem, you mean the lack of infrastructure.
I mean the lack of infrastructure, and where are you going to refuel?
Without a doubt. That's a significant impediment to the adoption of battery electric technology in the over-the-road, long-haul, heavy-duty trucking, definitely. We also believe there are weight or energy density challenges and also price and cost challenges which have yet to be overcome.
All right, tell me what those are.
So currently, if you want to engineer a truck with the same power and the same range as today's diesel or natural gas technology, it will weigh approximately 3 times as much as today's cab because of the weight of batteries needed for the power and the energy. So that's one challenge.
And so that challenge then creates a challenge for the various states and localities that are trying to keep their roads repaired, because that extra weight adds to road wear, does it not?
That would be a consequence of that.
And since most of our taxes currently are based on taxing the diesel to get road money, wouldn't that also then create a problem for the local governments and the state governments for having enough funds to repair the roads as a result of that extra weight?
That could definitely happen as well, yes.
All right. Well, I do think that we need to increase our infrastructure, both for natural gas and to make sure that we have refueling for electric as we move into this direction. As I said, I'm all of the above. I'm open to it. But we have to solve these problems on both road maintenance and on refueling, because for a lot of the truckers in my area, driving up and down Interstate 81, just in the state of Virginia, you have 328 miles. If you can't drive that far on a tank and there's no place to refuel when you get to the end of the line, you're not going to use that technology no matter how efficient it might be and how much it might do for the environment. I appreciate it very much, and I appreciate you all being here today. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. So I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. I'm so glad that we got to this topic, because I think there are exciting opportunities ahead. We have the climate solutions. We know how to do this. We know how to unleash American ingenuity. We must find cleaner and carbon-free solutions for how we move people and goods across America and across the globe. And families and consumers will benefit greatly. Lower cost. Let's talk about a few of them. And by the way, this isn't decades away. This is now. For families and communities, when we talk about reducing carbon pollution, we talk about better health. Communities and families will be healthier, and that will help save money. Transportation-related businesses have a whole lot to gain when fuel costs come down dramatically. This is going to be a revolution that we live through over the coming years. If the Congress has the courage to act and put the incentives where they need to be put. Just look at what fuel economy has done on the passenger car side. Every time, for decades, every time the Congress has pushed automobile manufacturers to do better, they've met the challenge. But we're at risk right now of ceding that leadership to other countries, like China. Plus, we can create good family-sustaining jobs as we build this clean energy economy. Yes, in rural areas, and we need to talk about the areas across the country that need those investments. Ms. Romero, talk to us about what the cost would be if we just stuck with the status quo.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about the decimation of communities across the country. And honestly, even looking at having less than 11 years or less than 10 years till the next level of global catastrophe isn't enough. We're looking at low-income communities and communities of color today, surrounded by busy freeways and highways, surrounded by pollution, where asthma and other pollution-related illness is impacting their ability to do anything. And so the consequences are grave. They're human.
And you say, gosh, start with school buses.
And start with school buses. Why not? I mean, we need a lot more than that, obviously, in a comprehensive approach, a massive mobilization of resources. But
that's an area where we could get co-benefits. We could get co-benefits there by reducing the costs for school districts. Maybe they can plow some of those fuel costs back into the classroom, and plus kids will be having a healthier ride to school.
And we'll raise the whole next generation to understand the new technology and be the leaders for the next future decades.
Mr. Logan, what do you see are the cost of the status quo?
In the same way with children across the country, there are communities in and around ports that are bearing the brunt of the health consequences in the multiple billions of dollars in health care costs. And so there's both the health costs, but there's also the lost days of work, and there's also the low productivity of many different sectors. I mentioned earlier agriculture, but also within the manufacturing as well. And if we don't resolve this issue, we're not going to have goods to move. We won't be having this conversation because we won't need to move things. We won't have things to move.
Mr. Popple, I think Proterra really tells an important story. You're currently building these electric buses in South Carolina and in California. What other parts of the country do you think can support these manufacturing jobs as we move forward? And I just know we're going to invest a whole lot more. It just makes too much sense for local communities back home. So what do you see? What does the future hold? Can we go into rural areas and areas that need a little bit of economic development for these clean energy jobs?
Absolutely, especially, Congresswoman, if we focus on early adopter categories like transit and school bus. Transit in particular has a Buy America requirement, which means 70% or more of the supply chain has to come from domestic sources. So if you look at our product, it's not a product that just benefits California and South Carolina. Charging stations for us are built in Michigan. Electric motors are built in Colorado. Our composite bodies are built in Iowa and Rhode Island. So there's a national supply chain that can be set up on the vehicle side and on installing the infrastructure. And all of that infrastructure, that's local, so that's a local job to that community.
And you said we're at risk right now to ceding leadership in the world to China and other countries. Is that right?
Absolutely, Congresswoman. And I think what's at risk is if we become less productive at moving goods and people than other global countries or other global economies, they will have a profound economic advantage, just like if we were stuck with propeller planes and the rest of the world moved to jets.
Well, I want to thank you all very much. I want to thank the minority and Mr. Graves and my colleagues for a terrific discussion. We're going to continue the focus on the transportation sector moving forward. To use Ms. Romero's analogy, we should celebrate the U.S.'s ability to reduce carbon and air pollution, but the game is still on. We need to keep our hustle to achieve the type of reduction science shows we need to achieve to avoid it being game over for our children and future generations. That's what this committee's work is all about. As we heard in our second hearing from Dr. Liverman, every ton of CO2 we keep from going up in the atmosphere is important, because every increase in temperature counts to the health of people and the planet. So thank you again for being here today. Thank you again, colleagues. The committee is adjourned.